All right, happy Friday. Got a recording going. I got my participant panel up and running. I'm gonna do something a little bit different this morning. We're gonna start with some warm up, but I actually want to give you a Google Doc to kind of do live note taking. So if you don't want to code along, if you want to like code up in a Google Doc, and everyone can contribute to that. So we'll get to that once we finish the warm up. But I got a handful of warm up questions for you, and I'm gonna write them in the Zoom chat as soon as I can find the Zoom chat. There's the Zoom chat. I'm going to drop these in here. And then what I want to do is find what I'm doing. Here we go. There it is. All right. So I got 4 warm-up questions for you. I'm going to give you like 5 minutes in random breakout rooms. Put you in rooms of 3, I think. And want to explore a handful of questions. So I dropped those in chat. I'll let you just think about it for just a sec. We're gonna come back, we're gonna do this, and then I'm actually gonna like live code a little bit about getting some of these testing tools implemented in our mock tracker, as I'm calling it. And it's very kind of aptly named since we're gonna be getting into some mocking and stubbing today. And then answer questions along the way, of course. All right, everybody good? I'm gonna give you some random breakout rooms. 7 breakout rooms. Where's that to go? And I'll give you just 5 minutes or so just to think about that. And then once we kind of come back, and we'll kind of discuss these questions as a team, and then I'll share that Google Doc with you, and then y'all can like dig in on some live note taking while I'm coding, and just sharing some ideas about how we can test our API consumption. Cool. Any questions before I send you off? It's just a quick one, just a quick 5 minutes to go through these questions. So rotate around. I will call on rooms when you get back. So maybe decide on a spokesperson as well. All right, here come your rooms. We'll see you back in a couple of minutes. All right, so while everybody is out in their breakout room, they're basically looking at 4 warm-up questions. What are the pros and cons of making real API calls in our software testing? And then thinking back to mod 1, what are the 4 parts of a strong software test? We've kind of already talked about it. So hopefully that'll be like more front of mind for them. And then what are mocks and stubs? What are the differences between them? How have they used them in mod 1 and mod 2 so far? Although that question is going to change a little bit. And then bonus points of why do I love testing so much? So pros and cons, we get to hit the real API. We get to see, for example, that the API is still actually working. We know that thing like the data coming back is actually what we expect to come back, that nothing has changed on the external API. The main downside is we have to be connected to the internet. We're using real API calls. So if we're, if we're worried about rate limits, then that could be a potential problem. Going back to mod 1, when we teach test-driven development, we teach them about an anagram called SEAT, setup, exercise, assertion, and teardown. So setup is like, what do we need to sort of set up in our environment in order to test our code? The E for exercise is like, how do we actually do something that's going to go actually run the code? In this case, actually go make that that API call. The assertions are like our expectations in our spec, like what do we want to assert has happened. Teardown happens a lot for us in Rails, so we don't typically have to manually do any teardown. Mocking and stubbing, mocks are basically just fake objects, and then stubbing is like a fake response. That'll be like a really high level on that one. And then why do I love testing so much? I love getting into storytelling mode on this one. But sometimes I worry a little bit that it raises anxiety of what it's like to be at a startup, and may scare some students away from working at startups. But it is a reality of being at startups. It's pretty chaotic. There's a lot going on. In order to hit deadlines, the first thing that goes out the door is like readmes and documentation. And the second thing to go out is testing. And so you end up getting really stressed out about like how things are tested and how fully things get tested and so on. So I'll be relaying some stories about that kind of as we go. but we'll see what they all come up with in their rooms. They got about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and we'll see you back with the rest of the team. Welcome back. We'll give everybody just a few seconds to join us back again. All right, everybody's back. Welcome back, everybody. All right, in your Code Help channel, I've dropped a Google Doc that you should all have edit access to. So let's go in and talk a little bit about these, and let's see what we got. So real API calls, we got some pros and we got some cons. Let's see what y'all come up with on this. We're going to start with room number 6. As soon as I find my interface here, go back to my breakout rooms. Room number 6 is going to be Adam, Gus, and Ryan. So tell me about some pros about making real API calls in our software testing. What'd you come up with?
One pro means that you actually have, like, if something were to change on the API, like they were to change their calculation or they get new data, then what you get back will change as well. So I mean, it's realistic, but the problem is I won't give you the negative, so somebody else can give you the negative.
All right.
Yeah, no,
Good.
related positive to that is, I think Gus mentioned this, if they change the structure and then all of a sudden your test fails, you will catch that and you can then fix it.
Yeah, so any kind of change they make, whether it's the data itself or the structure of the data, yeah, we know that right away. Yep, good. Cool, let's go to room number 2. Let's see if you had anything additional. So Alex, Sydney, and Phil, any additional like pros to making real API calls?
We said something similar in ours, yeah.
All right, cool. Well, in that case, stay on the line with me here, Sydney, and give me some cons. What are some negative things about making real API calls?
Literally the opposite of that. Like, so things change and your tests start failing. So yeah, it's kind of something you have to manage. You'd have to always manage those tests.
We also talked about the if we got to a production level test suite, you know, if we're hitting this API 500 times every time we run our tests, you're going to be burning up keys, or you're going to start failing tests and builds because you've got a key that is been locked out.
Yep. So we're using up API calls when we talk about like rate limiting. Yep, that's definitely an important one for sure. All right, let's open it up to just anyone. Does anyone else have any other pros and cons that you've discussed in your rooms? Give you just a few seconds and we're going to move on to the next question. Got a lot to get through. Aiden, any other pros and cons?
Yes, someone might have mentioned this already, but the speed of like using a real API call, if it takes a while to get a response back and you have a bunch of tests, it could really slow it down.
Yep. And related with that, we have to actually have an internet connection in order to do these tests. So if you're on your laptop, for example, and you want to go work, you know, you're going camping or something and you're trying to run your tests, you can't unless you've also got like an internet spot nearby. So we're using the real internet. So we need internet access to run tests. Less of a problem these days than in the past, but so it seems like we have a lot more cons than we have pros when it comes to making real API calls in our tests. All right, let's go back to question number 2. We're going to go to room number 7. Room number 7 is Grayson, Joe, and V. Let's talk about the different parts of a software test. Did you all happen to remember the anagram from Mod 1? We kind of talked about it earlier in the week, so I was hoping that you'd all remember.
We didn't remember from Mod 1. I had to look back at like one of the Mod 1 lessons to see it. And it's setup assertion, or setup execution, assertion, and then teardown.
Yep. So we got setup, exercise, assertion and tear down. Yeah, so setup is like, what do we need? Like, what does our test need? So what does our test need? Exercise is like, actually go do something. Our assertion is like our expect statements in our spec. And then tear down, I mean, thankfully, we don't really have to tear the stuff down ourselves. Rails does a lot of this for us. Sometimes, though, we occasionally have like a little bit of cleanup that we have to do. But yep, great. And then what are mocks and stubs? Let's call on a room we haven't called on yet. Let's do room number 3. Catherine, Eli, and Mike. What'd you all come up with for mocks and stubs? Like, what is a mock? We'll start with what is a mock?
I'm not very good at like defining it exactly verbatim, but in our case, the mock would be like the HTTP request, and then the stub would be what you're getting back. So like what you put, like the JSON response.
So tell me a little bit more. So you said that a mock is an HTTP request?
Yeah, so like what we're sending to the API call, and then the stub would be like stubbing what we're getting back from that return. So like, but in mod 1, the mock would be the method, and the stub would be what you're passing through the method. But I'm not too sure how to describe it as it is.
Pretty close. Pretty close. A mock is basically a fake object of some kind, and then a stub is going to be like a fake method response. That's the easiest way that I can sort of describe that. So a mock, so you could think of like a mockingbird. It's going to mimic, what something else does as far as like the look and the feel. If anyone else is like big into like Marvel comic book, I think of like Mystique, who can like sort of impersonate someone else. It would be the same sort of thing with mocks in that regard. And then a stub is saying, if I call this method, just always give me back this response. In fact, a lot of you have now implemented a stub in your project, which is the allow any instance of. Allow any instance of. And this is basically where we can say, like, when I call this method, always give me back this response no matter what. Where the mock is actually like, go make a fake object of some kind. And so we're pretending that we have an object of some sort.
So just to make sure, like, I heard you properly and I've got my wires crossed, would that then be that the mock is the HTTP request and the response would be what we're getting back?
In this case, we could say that the mock could be like the actual Faraday connection, like the actual Faraday object of setting up our connection. We could mock that and come up with a mock object and then say, for that mock object, if I call .get, then I always expect to get this back as a response. But that response has a lot of parts to it. And so we probably wouldn't do something at such a high level. But we could mock like a user object and say, pretend I've got a user. And now that I've got a user, like if I call a method or an attribute on that user, now we're getting into stubbing. If I say user.email, I could stub that I always come back with a known string. Or if I'm doing an active record lookup of user.friends, I can stub the response for friends to always come back with an array of something. That's where we're getting into the difference between mocking and stubbing. So the mock would be like the actual fake object, and the stub is a faked response of like an attribute, which technically when we call an object's attribute, we're really calling a method that actually goes and fetches that attribute from our object. So if any of you used FactoryBot in mod 2, FactoryBot is basically setting up mock objects, and the values that you pass into FactoryBot, where you say, I want the email to be this, or I want the password to be that, that's then setting up a stub. So that's how we use mocks and stubs. All right, Gus, you got a question, what's up?
Yeah, if you if you're using a fixture file with data, like to sort of stand in for a data set that you would be creating, is that technically considered a mock, or is that that's just a fixture and it's its own thing?
So when we talk about fixture data, which we're going to get into in the class today, fixture data is depending on what you're using it for, like you could, like I would put that more in the camp of like the stubbed response. Like if I actually call, you know, JSON.parse, you know, for this thing, then I expect to get this structure of data back. Or when I pretend to make this Faraday call, I want to get back this Faraday structure or this JSON response. So because you're sort of faking a response, that would fall into the stub category, as opposed to I have a fake object that I'm going to pretend to do something with. The benefit to making a fake object is that we don't have to go set up the whole object and everything else that would be involved in that. Like if you're going to make like a fake viewing party, for example, you don't have to go make the user for the host, and you don't have to go make all this stuff. You can just assign like a host ID or whatever. And so you can kind of like make like a fake object and then just stub out what you want those different attributes to be. So those are the main differences between the mocks and stubs. Cool. Any other questions on that before we move on? See in chat, mocks and stubs are a sticking point. You're going to have a lot of practice with mocks and stubs. The tools that we're going to be getting into today are called Webmock and VCR, and you're going to use them a lot in the rest of Mod 3. So hopefully you'll get comfortable with it, or at least more practiced, at least. Even if you don't get comfortable with it, you will be practiced at the very least. Sandra had your hand up. What's up?
Just curious, like just thinking through all those things. Like when we do like a before each block, or even like within a test block, and we create an instance right then, we're like creating an instance in our test database that we're using temporarily until that breakdown. Mm-hmm. Is that totally different, even though like we're just making it up, or is that considered like real data almost, but that's just temporary?
It's a bit of both, actually. That's a good question. So in a before each, if you're saying like, hey, in this before each, I need to actually go make a user in my database, you're actually putting real data in the database. And so in that case, it's actual real data. But because it's a test database, it's meant to be throwaway data. So we kind of say, well, this is like, it is sort of like a mock, but in the actual literal, you know, technical definition of what is a mock and a stub, it's actually neither. It's actually real data. You're actually putting something for real in the database. Where we get into mocking is like doing something like a factory bot, because factory bot is just setting up all kinds of mocks and stubs. So it's not actually necessarily hitting the database. Although I think in factory bot's case, most of the time it will actually, like if you say go create a user, it will actually go put it in the database for you. But then you're kind of like stubbing out, like when you say like go get this stuff. I think there's a little bit happening under the hood where it's hanging onto some of that in memory, so it's not necessarily going up to the database, but most of the time factory bot is dealing with the database. So
but it's like at least
kind of go
like
either way on that.
Fake data.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fake data. It's all fake data because it's just our test environment. Yeah. But whether it's strictly a mock or a stub, I would say even factory bot's not even really a mock or a stub, but we are kind of like faking the data as we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, great questions. All right. So bonus points. Why does Ian love testing so much? Had anybody ever heard anything leading up to now? Like, wait till you get Ian. Ian as an instructor is going to like drill test-driven development into you. Anybody ever heard any like stories along the way? I'm probably the biggest fan at Turing when it comes to test-driven development. I'm just curious if anybody, only rumors. That's great. Insert that joke here. No, like if no one's actually ever heard any stories. So pushing the keychain sales, that's right. Yeah, making those always write tests first. That was actually a phrase I came up with, I think with 1810. It was like one of the 1800 cohorts. I actually taught them in mod 1 and then again in mod 2. And so like they got drilled on test-driven development for sure. And I do mock interviews, yeah. Cool. So looking for an example in our room. I'm gonna pick on Joe. Adam, Max, Gus, Yessie, Isabel, V. Actually, most of you all have dark hair. I used to have gloriously dark hair, like gloriously dark hair. And I worked at a startup in Santa Monica where I was literally putting in like 80, 90 hours a week. Not that any of you could ever relate to putting in 80 hours a week for any such nonsense. But yeah, the startup stress was legit. And basically, I was working like 90 hours a week for like 13 months straight. And I was the only one working on this really business critical portion of software. At the same time, I also consider it like one of the pinnacles of my engineering career. Like the stuff I built there was pretty fantastic, and I love what I built there, even though it was like 2008, 2009. It was like quite a while ago. I still look back on that and go, wow, look what I made. That was pretty cool. But I was so stressed out all the time because we were under such tight deadlines as a startup. The first thing that goes out the window in startup land, or when you've got deadlines, is your readmes and your documentation. The second thing to get thrown out is your testing, because you got a deadline to hit and it takes time to write tests. And that's one of the main cons of doing TDD is you're spending all this time writing all these tests so that you've got some confidence that your code is working. The downside is if you skip all those tests, now when your code breaks, it's actually in production and now you've got angry customers. And so is it not better to invest that time ahead of time so you don't have angry customers? But not all management see it that way, but that's usually my selling point when I try to convince somebody that TDD is worth pursuing. But literally within a year of leaving that job, my hair turned white. Like it was pretty ridiculous, like how quickly my hair went gray after that job. I was just so stressed out all the time. And TDD really wasn't a thing back in 2008, 2009. Like TDD as an idea was really born in like 2006, 2007, and it happened in Java land. And they came up with the idea of, could we write some software to test our software? And they came up with the idea of unit testing. And they made a library called JUnit. And then the PHP development community kind of jumped on board and they're like, hey, I like that. Let's build that too. And because PHP folks aren't very clever, they called it PHP unit. And it kind of like spun off from there because PHP and Java were really, really popular at the time. And then other languages started developing testing libraries and so on. But when I was at this particular company, I was doing everything in Perl. And Perl didn't have good testing tools. And I remember the whole time sitting in this job wishing, I wish I had a way of like knowing whether this was going to break before I push it out to production, then find out everything's falling over. And now I'm like behind on my work and I've got to fix production all at the same time. So I've been a huge fan of TDD since I learned it at the following job, like getting into like PHP unit. I'm like, oh, look at this like really cool tool. And then moving from that into SendGrid, where we were very strict about TDD. It's like this place of Zen of just like, now I've got this confidence that my code's going to work. And so I'm a huge fan of TDD. But there are times where it's okay to like spike on something. We were kind of joking the other day when we were talking about solo spikes on this project, and someone mentioned like, oh, Ian just said like, don't test your code. Spike code is meant to get thrown away. So it's not meant to be kept so that you kind of get an idea of like what it is you're going to go build. And then you write tests and let your test errors sort of drive out what you're doing. So ever since then, like any kind of driven development, dream driven, test driven, document driven, like all of those kinds of driven development tools that we kind of touch on a little bit here at Turing, just give you this much deeper sense of appreciation that your code is going to work. Now, as we talked about earlier, there are lots of pros and cons with some of this, more cons than pros when it comes to hitting real APIs. But there are pros and cons with testing. It gives you the confidence, but it takes time. You can also get really caught in the weeds of like test for this and test for this. And what about this edge case? And what about that? And, you can get so caught up in the time writing tests that you never get around to actually writing the implementation. And then you're still risking your deadline. And so there is a balance to be struck. So I want to be clear, there is a balance to strike with like, start with happy path and then go write your implementation, then go write some sad path tests, then go write your sad path implementation, and then think about edge cases. But don't think too deeply about sad path and edge cases, because you can really get stuck in the weeds around like, what if they put a poop emoji in there? What if they put, you know, a kanji symbol in there? What if they put, you know, something like, you can get so caught up in all the different things that a user could try. So the general rule that that we followed at SendGrid was test for what 90% of our users are going to do. And most of the time, 90% of your users are going to do exactly what you tell them to do and use exactly the interface that you provide them, which is our happy path. Did the QA engineer role exist in 2008? Kind of, but the QA engineer role back then was like, you know, we can't push this out to production yet. So we're going to build a staging environment which mimics production. So it's going to have all the same number of servers. We're going to have a copy of the production data in our database, but in a staging database. And we're going to push all of our new code up to that. And then the QA process was like, go through, click every link, go through every single page, look for, you know, did that actually work or not? And if not, then like figure out like what broke, why did it break, and go like make a bug report back to the engineering team. I will tell you one last story, and then we'll take a palm break, and then we'll dive into the lesson for today. I worked on a website a long time ago. A friend of mine really sold me on the idea of coming up with a 5-year plan. And I'm like, that's a cool idea. I'm going to make a whole website about making a 5-year plan, where you can add your goals, break them down into tasks, and then add effectively an accountability buddy to each of those tasks. So I could say, you know, my goal is to learn how to play guitar. And so I'm going to let V hold me accountable to like take a guitar lesson. And I'm going to make James hold me accountable to actually like learning a song by June. And I'm going to get Sam to hold me accountable that by such and such a date, blah, blah, blah. And then it would actually print this out as a 5-year plan. You could like put it up on your wall. But then it would also email all your friends saying, hey, Sam, it's time to check in with Ian on that goal. And so as you share your goals, it was like going to do all the stuff. So a newspaper reporter reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I've been doing some research on goals and different sorts of websites out there. I came across your website. Could I talk about your website in this press article? And it was a newspaper in Florida at the time. And I'm like, that'd be cool. And he said, okay, well, I'll let you know before it publishes, just so, you know, everything can be online and everything's good to go. Some of you probably imagine where the story's going. And I'm like, sweet. So he notified me like the day before. He's like, hey, the thing's going to press tomorrow. It was literally going out in like printed newspaper at the time. And I think they also did it online. And I'm like, sweet, it's going out tomorrow. I'm just going to go add like a crap load of features to my website. And I finished at like 2 a.m. And being the cocky developer that I was, I'm like, that's all going to work. No problem. Deploy, went to bed. I was in California at the time. Florida's 3 hours ahead. So everybody waking up in the morning, you know, finding this newspaper, they're like, what is my5yearplan.com? And my site was completely broken. I had broken my user registration system. And so like tens of thousands of people in Florida tried to hit my website to sign up and read information about my site. And my whole site was offline because I didn't bother like manually testing that my code actually worked. So yeah, just little horror stories like that over the years will give you gray hair. So yeah, just that's why I love testing so much. It's just, it gives you the confidence that, you know, like you can go to bed and you can sleep at night and know that your code's going to work. The site is not live, actually. I took it offline quite a while ago, but I actually did find an old archived copy of the press release, and some of it was a little cringeworthy. Like going back and like reading it, it's like, oh, you know, it's like, you know, stabbing myself in the back of like, oh, you know, I did that to myself. Like I should have, like, I could have at least looked at it after I deployed and made sure that it was working. Like it would have taken me like 5 or 10 minutes to like click through some things and make sure that that stuff worked. But I was also in a hurry to like add a bunch of features that I thought was going to help, because I was charging people like $5 a month to use the site. It wasn't a lot. And so I was hopeful that I was going to wake up the next morning and like have all this, you know, money sitting in my PayPal account. And it didn't happen. And we all know what happens when you go to a website that breaks. You never, ever go back to that website ever again. And so my website analytics like really peaked, and then it completely bottomed out and stayed flat after that. So I was super disappointed. But it was a fun project to build. If anybody wants to do like a custom project. Anyway, cool. Let's take a palm break. We'll come back in 5, and then we'll actually jump into the lesson for the day. So we'll come back at 9:40. See you then. The danger with live testing or lack of testing in the workplace is real. Being on call sucks. I will tell you that from experience. Being woken up at like 2 in the morning that something broke is not an awesome feeling. And it also kind of lowers management's trust in the team when things break like that. But at the same time, I don't want to like scare anybody away from like, oh my gosh, working in real production systems is scary, and I don't think I want to go do that. Yeah, you do. It's actually a lot of fun. But being on call does suck. Cool. So I read out some last agenda items in that Google Doc. If anybody feels like live note taking along the way, that would be helpful. I'm actually not going to be writing anything else in that Google Doc, but I did put a couple of points about like what we're going to talk about as far as Webmock VCR and how we're going to use those. I do have my participant panel up. I got my chat window up. I'll do my best to pay attention to chat, but without Tim around today, if anybody else sees a question go by that I miss, please raise your hand or unmute. Say, hey, there's a question. Could you go check? Otherwise, I'm going to kind of like code up a little bit in our mock tracker interface, like how to start implementing these. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between Webmock and VCR, how they sort of partner together in our code, why things are helpful to use these tools, some downsides as we go. I'll be discussing all that. Absolutely, please ask questions as we go as well. And then we'll wrap up right around 11. All right, so let's dive in. We talked a little bit about pros and cons, so thanks for the warm-up discussion on all of that. Let's dive into some code. Let me go share my screen. Share this whole screen. So I got a code editor, I got a terminal, and I got Postman up and running over here. So we'll have a lot of different sort of tools kind of on the go. All right, let's get a few last things rearranged. There we go. All right, so let's talk about Webmock. The last time we met, we kind of like got in and wrote out this API call to actually go fetch some data, but none of this got tested. So if we were to actually go like implement SimpleCov and look at our test coverage would be kind of low because we're not actually testing that we're hitting this. I mean, we kind of are, but not as thoroughly as we could be. So we want to sort of see how Webmock is going to help us out with this. Yeah, so let's dive in. Let's see what's going on. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some stuff to our gem file. Not in there. I'm going to do it over here. Gem file. And this is the kind of thing we only need in test mode. So we don't have a section just for testing. But really, we don't need like some of these things. I mean, maybe pry in dev mode, but we don't need launchy, should have matchers, all this kind of stuff. So I'm actually just going to make a group here for testing. So our test environment is going to run just these things. And I'm going to move some of the stuff out of here. So we do need Figaro in development and test mode. Faraday actually does belong up here in the production side of things, as Tim mentioned. RSpec Capybara, those are going to come down here in test mode only. Should have matchers and launcher are going to come down here in test mode only. And then we're going to add a gem for Webmock. Now, if you have Rubicop installed, Rubicop's going to be like, these should be in alphabetical order. That's the kind of like really annoying stuff about Rubicop that you could probably ignore or like turn off the rule because that really doesn't matter. It's just a presentation thing at that point. But we're going to go ahead and we're just going to add gem Webmock in here, and then we need to go bundle. So we'll go bundle that up. So all I did here was I made a group for just our test environment. So we have our combined development and test. We have just test, we have just development, and then everything else is kind of like production level in here. So the first thing we needed to do is just add that into our gem file. We get that bundled in. So now we need to actually go add some stuff to our spec helper. So, or our Rails helper. I like doing everything in the Rails helper as opposed to the spec helper. All right, so what we need to do in here is we need to actually require in our Webmock. I like to put the requires up at the top. So I'm going to go require Webmock RSpec. Oops. And it will help if you spell it correctly. So what this is doing is it's going to say like, hey, go grab that Webmock gem and then go add all the hooks for RSpec in here. So now if I try to run RSpec and see what's going on in our testing, it should block us now. Because what Webmock is going to do, oh no, it didn't work. Why didn't that work? That should have worked. Add Webmock. That should have blocked us from making a real API call. So why didn't that work? Lesson plans had to put it in the spec helper. It really doesn't matter where we put it, but let's try it in the spec helper. I don't think that's going to make a difference for us. Oh, you know what? I think it, oh, I know what happened. I think this require, we actually need to put it inside this config block, this RSpec configure. I think it actually has to be inside of there. So I'm going to put it down to bottom, but inside that configure block. Let's try and put it there. I don't know if that's actually going to make a difference from a scoping point of view. Let's find out. Nope, that still did not block us. All right. So let's dive in and figure out why that didn't stop us from making a real API call, because that should have blocked us. We should have seen like this big error about, hey, you're not allowed to make real API calls. So let's go see what happened there. So we added that to our gem file. It ended up in our gem file lock. And we added that to our Rails helper. Those should be the only instructions we need in order to stop us from making real API calls. For some reason, though, this is actually allowing API calls to go out. And I'm wondering if something changed in Webmock. Sometimes this will happen in our gems. They'll make changes. And because when we do a gem file, we're saying like, go grab any version of Webmock. Just grab like the latest and greatest. And then suddenly our lessons go out of whack. So let's diagnose this a little bit because this should stop us. Joe, you got your hand up. What's up?
The GitHub page says to, I know you mentioned it, that to add it to the spec helper, but you add it to the Rails helper. Can you talk about the difference in that?
It shouldn't matter which one we put it in because these are both going to get loaded up. But it shouldn't matter that whether we put it in here or not, because they both have like an RSpec configure. And I believe the spec helper file actually calls the Rails helper file, or vice versa. I always mix that one up. But they actually call, like one calls the other. Let's just throw it in spec helper.
Ian,
see whether that makes a difference.
I'm not super sure we have an API call in our tests.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, so Tim didn't write any test at all for this? Tim, what happened to TDD, man? All right, cool. Well, let's go write a test. So I think this was working. Thank you for bringing that up. I thought Tim had written a test for that. So I'm going to put it back in my Rails helper because I really like having all those requires up top up here. That's just how I like to organize things. Your mileage may vary. TDD stands for Tim didn't do. That's awesome. Love it. Should make that a hashtag and make sure to bug them about that. All right, well, let's go write a test. So we have a feature test. We have login registration. Yeah, we don't actually have a test for that. So let's go make a quick test. I'm going to do it just in the feature level, and we'll call this user. What are we going to call it? We'll call it like government search spec.rb. So if we go back and we take a look at the file of what we actually had going. So it was one of our controllers. It was our ProPublica controller, and it was a search endpoint. We were taking in a param of search, and that was taking in a last name. So let's just build this out real quick. So require our Rails helper, and we're going to do like an RSpec describe. Let's call this like government search do. And inside here, we're going to describe that a user can search successfully. Let's call this happy path. Happy path, not happy path. Typing is hard on a Friday. And it allows user to search for government members. All right, so we can actually just dive right into like a visit path or a visit on our path helper on this. So if we go look at our routes, search Senate members. Okay, that's going to make it for a really long path helper. So let's go run rake routes and see what our path helper is going to be. Search Senate members path. Nope, that's well, it's post. Shoot, we're not going to be able to start there. We're actually going to need to start at our dashboard, I guess. Do we have that on a dashboard? You remember that from the lesson? And a welcome controller with a user controller.
I believe we do.
A public controller. Where do we actually start that search from? I don't think we actually have like a drop down for that, where we have like a form where we fill in a search. All right, so we're missing several parts. I'll get this beefed up in our code base over the weekend. Joe, I see you got your hand up. What's up?
Old hand, sorry.
Okay, no problem. People are saying maybe in the welcome controller. Our welcome controller didn't have anything in it. It was just our index page. So unless that page has a form in it. Oh, there is a form there. Hey, look at that. Thank you. Appreciate that. Is my keyboard actually a pillow? I can never hear me typing. It's a Bluetooth. It's a Logitech keyboard. I hate noisy mechanical keyboards. That's just me. But don't take that as a slight against you if you use a mechanical keyboard. I'm just not a big fan of the big clacky kind of thing. Plus, my microphone's actually pretty sensitive, and I didn't want it to pick up like clack, 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 clack while I'm coding, because I do a lot of coding during my classes. So, all right, so we have a welcome page. So we're going to need to start there in our test. So thank you for helping me find that. So we do need to visit our route path, and it doesn't look like we have to be logged in to use this. So that's good. We can skip a step there. And we're just going to go fill in this thing. So we're going to visit this. We're going to fill in.
You're missing an I on your visit.
I am. Thank you. So we're going to fill in. What's our form called? Search. All right. So we're going to fill in search with, and we need a member. And I think we were looking for Sanders before, right? Bernie Sanders. So I'll just look for Sanders. And then we're going to click our button that says search. All right, so now we should expect to be on a page. I'm not going to put that expectation in, but if we go look at what that controller is doing, it's actually not redirecting anywhere afterwards. We're actually not doing anything with the data, but we are expecting that we're going to make that API call. So this should be enough. Just clicking that button is our exercise, because clicking that button is going to submit that form to this code, and that's effectively going to be our exercise. So we're not going to build an expectation in this test. I will go back and like add some stuff to our code base over the weekend. But for now, this should be all we need. So now if we go back and we run that as a test, and then I'll isolate just that one test while we're in here. Okay, there we go. So this is the failure that we wanted. Thanks for your patience on that. So now we're basically, so let's dissect this a little bit. I love going through and like showing you how I read these error messages. The first thing is like, where did it fail? It gives us the rspec command down here. If we want to isolate just this test, we can copy and paste that. And it includes the line number of the test that's actually failing. When we look at the test output, it gives us like this big angry red text, if you can see the color red. And it's basically saying the net connection is not allowed. So Webmock is actually blocking us from making an internet connection for this API call. This is Webmock's job. It's basically a gatekeeper saying, nope, you shall not pass. It's basically Gandalf from Lord of the Rings saying, you shall not pass. Can't make that real API call. And it's also telling us that that failed because of our controller on line 17 and the test stopped at line 9. So it's really important that you look at these line numbers so you can kind of like backtrack where things happened. And remember, in Ruby, everything kind of happens bottom up. So we started in our test on line 9, that got to our controller on line 17, and then it threw this error. The neat thing about Webmock, and this is one of the things I really appreciate about test-driven development in Rails, is this error message is immensely helpful. It's saying, hey, I'm going to stop you from doing this, but here's a block of code that you can put in place to actually go do what you're trying to do and build that stub for us. So we can literally copy all of this, and we're going to just paste this straight into our code. So in our test, go back, we are in our test. What we're going to do before we even visit that root path, I'm going to do this as our setup. So I'm going to go stub that request. And we don't need all of this stuff in here, and I will go through and kind of explain what all of these things are doing, because we don't actually need all of this stuff in here. But what it's doing here is it's saying like, hey, if I make this get call and I pass these headers, then I want it to return a status of 200 with a known body as our response, with known headers as a response. So this actually gives you a lot of flexibility into what we actually want this to come back with. One downside to this though, actually not for this one, because this one doesn't need our API key, apparently. We don't actually see the API key showing up in that request, but there may be cases where this stub response or this stub setup in Webmock will actually expose your API key. You do not want that in your tests, because your tests will go up on GitHub. And so make sure that if it had the API key in here, like say as a query param, or it had like API key or something like that, that you would just do some string interpolation to make sure that that those things are going to be safeguarded. The API key is in the header, which is true, but what's interesting is it didn't actually say, like when I stub the request with these headers that I want to get this thing back, it didn't actually build a header for us with that, which makes me wonder if it actually sent that as a header. I mean, it should have, but we'll double check. So now what I want to do, if we, so now that we actually have that set up, which of these parts do we actually need? So the accept header here, this is basically saying, hey, server, when I send you this request, I will accept any kind of response you send me. We could hard code this and say, like, I only want to accept application JSON as a response. In this case, we don't need it. The encoding is like, hey, if you want to send it to me back in this kind of text, that would be great. gzip is like, if you want to compress it to save on internet traffic, that would be great. If you want to use deflate instead, that would be great. These are just different settings for that. We actually don't need any of that. We also don't even have to stub out that we're using Faraday, but this could be a place where we actually mock, like, hey, pretend I'm on Chrome for websites that that say, like, you know, you must use Chrome, or you must use a browser to access this stuff. They don't want you using tools like Faraday to scrape their data. They can actually look at the incoming user agent string and go, oh, you're not on a known browser, therefore we're not going to allow you. We're going to redirect you to some other page, and you can go scrape garbage all day. They'll actually block you based on that user agent string. You could come in here and actually mock out a different user agent if you wanted to. So in this case, we actually don't need headers at all, which then means we don't need that with block at all to actually happen. So now we can actually just go send this, and let's see what happens from here. So when I run just that test, again, I'm just going to isolate that one test just in case we break something else along the way. And now we can't JSON parse the response. And this is intentional. This is where we want to get to from here. V, you had a question. What's up?
I just want to make sure that I understand what would be an example situation that you would need those headers there.
So in this case, like, I would think that we should be sending that API key in the header. For whatever reason, our actual Faraday call is not actually sending that header, which tells me that ProPublica is allowing this to happen without authentication. So I'm going to go verify that by pulling it up in Postman. So this is why we want to have all these tools available to us. So I'm just going to pop over in here, and I'm going to try sending this over as a request without authentication. So I don't have any header set up with my API key in here for ProPublica. I have nothing set up under authorization. I'm just going to go ahead and send this. It did give me an unauthorized, which is interesting. So we do need that header What's interesting is it didn't actually build that header for us over here for our stub. For now, though, it's okay. But generally, yeah, if an API request is going to try to send a header, then we should be sending that stuff over. In this case, taking that part out, it still thinks that we're making the API call in the same fashion, even though we're not sending over that header. But generally, whatever Webmock comes back with when it's giving you this stub, just put that whole thing into your code. I just wanted to show you like these 3 headers, like the accept encoding, and user agent, you can remove those. And because this actually didn't build any other headers for us, we can actually take this out of here. Oh, I know why our API key is not in there, which is going to break other things, because I don't have this set up. I don't have my ProPublica key set up in here. So if I do a Figaro install, and just to make sure it's going to go build my app YAML file, let me go grab my ProPublica key and I'll go build that in here. So that's why it's failing. So let me back up and I'll explain my thought process here. It didn't include it as a header. And the reason that it didn't include it as a header is because in the actual code in here in Faraday, when we said, hey, go get this thing out of the environment, because it's not actually part of my environment, it is part of Tim's environment. Because it's not part of my environment, this actually comes back nil. So remember, whenever you try to access a hash key and that key's not in the hash, Ruby will give you back a nil. Faraday then says, well, I'm not going to set a header to nothing. And so it just excludes that header completely. And so what I'm going to do over here is I'm just going to set this up as env, because that's our preferred way of doing this. We talked about that in class yesterday. So I need to go set up my app.yaml to make sure that I have my ProPublica key in there. So I'm going to go open my app YAML file, application.yaml, not coming up for me. So code big application.yaml. There it is. All right, so I'm going to start my ProPublica key in here, and then we'll be good to go. So if I set this to ABC123, for example, and I come back over here and I try to run that test again. All right, so we still got an unexpected response, and that's because we started stubbing this out. So let me go comment out my stub, and now we'll take a look at what Webmock is trying to tell us to build. So now it's going to try to make a real API key, and now we can see that my ABC123 X API key is actually in there now. So again, you can just grab this whole thing, but we want to make sure that our API key doesn't actually get exposed. So I'm just going to replace all this. And so what we can do here is, again, we can use that env. Because we have Figaro set up for our development and test, we'll be able to actually go pull in our own environment variables here. And so I'm going to go grab that string of ProPublica API key. So this is what you need to do in your test. If you're going to use Webmock, please make sure that you're doing this and you're not actually exposing your API key in a test. All right, so let me go grab my ProPublica key. Ryan, you got a question? What's up?
Just gonna verify. I know you talked about it yesterday, but like, so just to restate, using the env instead of the Figaro is because in production we won't have access to Figaro. So you want to use those env? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. We don't have Figaro in our production level gems, and so if in production we try to say like Figaro.env, Rails would throw a fit and say, I don't know what Figaro is. Like, it's not a gem that I have access to, so I don't know what to do here. And your code's just going to start crashing. And so using the env hash is actually the preferred way of doing it. So whether you're using Figaro, .env, there's like a handful of other tools that will like take a configuration file and put all these things into environment variables for you. That way you don't have to install any of those in production. And then that will give us the flexibility both on Travis and Heroku to go set up environment variables named whatever we want. Those names just have to match what we put in here. And it's also going to be case sensitive. And so if you make this all lowercase in your application.yaml, it'll also have to be a lowercase key on Travis and Heroku. But then by setting up those environment variables, now we have the flexibility to like go change those environment variables on the fly, and we don't have to deploy any new code. For anybody that watched the demo comp, and they were asking the GTFO team, like, how did you test these kinds of things where you didn't have to bring up all of the systems and all the different servers? They basically said, well, we just changed an environment variable to say, you know, I don't want to test my Rails backend in development mode. I actually want to go hit the real Rails backend. And so I'm just going to set an environment variable with my Heroku URL. And now when my front end tries to hit the backend, I can run my front end Rails, but it's actually going to go hit the backend on Heroku instead of having to spin up like a bunch of terminals and start up a whole bunch of things all at the same time. And so it gives us a little more flexibility for that kind of stuff. Max, you had your hand up. What's up?
Yeah, you had mentioned yesterday using Figaro at one point to like clue to other developers that that's what you were using. Would that make sense to do in the tests, because the tests will never use the production, or tests will never be run in production?
We probably could. So yeah, I mean, the idea with Ruby and just high level programming languages in general is that we want it to be readable and we want it to be understood. Like, we want our intent to be understood by other developers. Now, if you were to clone down this repo, you would see in my gem file that I was trying to use Figaro. But you know, you could use your own .env instead. So it really comes down to like, how are you setting up your local environment to have access to that API key in some way? And so you could say like, you know what, as a development team, we're all just going to standardize on Faraday, or we're all going to standardize on .env. But if, you know, multiple people want to do it, that's fine. In development mode, you're just installing another gem that you're not using. So, you know, let's say Max wants to use .env and I want to use Figaro. It's just an extra gem in development mode, but neither one is going to production. And so how we set up our individual local environments is less consequential than like, you know, the fact that you know, these things have access to these environment variables. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Question in chat: does Heroku's Dino Sleep affect an API only app? Yeah, it does. So Heroku will only wait for like half an hour before it starts shutting down a dyno. And that's because Heroku is actually built on top of Amazon Web Services, and they pay Amazon for all that CPU time and all the network access and the storage and all that kind of stuff. And so Heroku, because they're giving a lot of the stuff away for free, they want to like spin that stuff down to reduce that cost as much as possible. And so that's why after, I think it's 30 minutes, and you go back and you try to hit your Heroku app, it takes like 30 seconds to a minute for that first request to give you a response. And then it's like fast after that for a period of time. It's because it's spinning all those things down. Now, that also brings up a really good point of when we're consuming an API, we should probably look for things like timeout errors, access errors, and things like that. Those would be good SAD path tests to write. Like, what happens if the thing's offline? Well, this is actually a really nice thing about Webmock. We can actually mock, like if I try to hit this thing, I'm going to get a status of 500 and I get a different body back, or I get a status of like 404. Like, how do I want to test my code if something about the API breaks, or if I'm sending something invalid? We can actually set all that kind of stuff up in Webmock. And so this is where Webmock is like super helpful as a development tool, because now we don't actually have to figure out, well, how do I actually go break ProPublica so that I can test that, you know, my code's going to behave properly if ProPublica gives me an error. We can actually mock that stuff out with Webmock. So it makes it really, really handy for just setting that kind of stuff up. All right, getting back on track. We're about due for a palm break, but let me do one more thing and then we'll go to a palm break. So over here in Postman, I was trying to do this thing, but I didn't have my XAPI key set up. So let's go see what this response would actually be if I set up a header in here, call it XAPI key. And again, case sensitivity has to match exactly what they have in their documentation. We're going to send that over. Still, oh, there we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab all of this stuff as the response. Now over here in our test, basically what we're seeing as our error message now when I try to run this is that it can't parse the JSON response. And that's on purpose because we're saying that the body that we're getting back is empty, which means over here in our ProPublica controller, when we're trying to do the JSON parse of our response body, that response body is blank and we can't parse that as JSON data. So our test over here, we're giving it a stubbed response saying, give me back nothing. And now it's failing here because it's trying to parse nothing. So we can do a couple of things here. We can actually set this up as like, stub data, and actually just store all of that in here as stub data, but we're going to do it as a file instead. And so over the palm break, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save all that in a file. And then I'm going to show you how to like call up that file from here. All that stuff is in the lesson plan. So don't worry too much about feeling left behind on that. Cool. Let's do a 5-minute palm. We'll come back at 10:16. So we'll come back at 16.
Boxes stubs are a weakness of mine, so I want to make sure I understand like the concept here. So just to restate it, the stub that we're doing allows us to sort of access the API, but it allows us to just like provide a canned response so that if the data changes, we can still test it. That's fundamentally what we're doing.
Yeah, pretty much at a high level. Yeah. So you're right when you're saying it's kind of a canned response. It's a known response.
Got it.
So from here, we can say like, I know that it's going to come back with this data. Like I mentioned right before the break, it makes it really handy if we want to set up like a known status code. If we want to like fake like what happens if this actually breaks, things like that. Totally. In a real production system, for example, if an API actually broke, you would have all kinds of logging, catching like what was the actual response. And now we can put that in a fixture file and like write tests around that response and go, if we get this kind of response back, this is how we want to handle it so that we can make sure that our user has a good user experience.
Is it still impacting our rate limit then? Because we're still accessing it?
No, because we're not actually hitting the API. What we're doing here in the stubbed response is we're saying in my code, anywhere in my code, if I try to actually go call this URL, I want you to do this instead. Now, if we were to go back and change like our actual controller here and change this to 117 instead of 116, our test would fail again. And so this would be a good distinction now that everyone's back. So we had a question here from Adam around like the idea of what is this stubbing actually doing? This isn't actually hitting the API, so we're not actually consuming an API call here. What this is saying is like anywhere in my code, if I try to access this URL using these headers, then I want you to give me back like a known response of some kind. So over here in our controller, if we change this from 116 to 117 and we go try to run that test again, it'll actually fail because it's saying, well, you're trying to hit this thing, you're trying to hit this 117. I don't know what to do with that, but here's how you can go stub that thing out. And as a developer, you're like, wait, I was stubbing that thing out. This is where you got to really pay attention to detail because maybe the header is slightly different, or maybe the URL is different. It's usually the URL in this case. And so Webmock is actually saying like, this is what you actually registered. This is a stub that I actually found. So the error message is actually longer than it used to be. It's saying you stubbed this one, but you're actually trying to hit this one. And so here's what you can do instead. And so it's actually pointing you, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't give you a good, like what we call a diff between them to show the difference between, here's what you actually stubbed, here's what you're actually trying to do, and the change is right here. Like it would be nice if it would just highlight, here's where the things were different so that you could just go change that quickly. But I like that the error messages here are like pretty helpful as far as like what you need to go stub in order to make this happen.
That's helpful. And if you're putting in the, hey, we're expecting 200, we're expecting this body. I mean, how do you actually test that the request actually works, that it is going to get you 200, that the body does actually contain the stuff you want?
That's a good question too, because right now we're faking this. We're not actually hitting it for real. And we're going to get into that next. So bear with me. We will get there in the lesson. All right, so I'm going to change this back to 116 so our code does not break. And then I'll just catch everybody up on what I did over the break here. So what I did is, let me open up my government data. So in Postman, when I called this earlier, I just grabbed all of this content. And what I did is I dumped all that content into a file. And I just called it government data.json. Now, where I put that file matters. Inside my spec folder, I made a fixtures folder and I put that file in there. Spec fixtures is sort of the typical path that you will see. It won't always be this way. It'll depend on what your team sort of decides on doing. But this will typically be where you put fixture data for your tests to run. So in this case, under spec, I made a folder called fixtures. I made a file called government data.json, and I just pasted all of that data in here. Now this data is enormous. This is like really, really big. It's almost 5,000 lines of text. So this is why it's helpful to put in a separate file. So now my test isn't actually 5,000 lines long, because it would get pretty unwieldy to like paste all of that in here and have to find all of my tests as well, especially if you're like trying different bits of data. Now, one thing I could do, because this is just test data, I could come in here and just shorten this and just say, you know what, just give me back like one member, give me back like 2 or 3 members. You don't have to give me all of these, because it's test mode. It can just be test dummy data if we want to. So in this fixture data, you can trim this stuff up if you want to. You don't have to keep all 5,000 lines, but for the sake of right now, for simplicity and essence of time, I'm just going to keep all this in here. So what I did in the test is I'm just doing a file.read on that file. Now remember that we're running all of our tests in the root folder of our project. And so when we do a file read, we have to give it the whole path of spec fixtures and then the file name. Okay. So what we're doing is we're pulling in everything out of this file and we're putting it into a variable. We call this slurping in programming. So we're slurping this file into memory and we're just storing it in a variable called JSON response. And now you can see this highlighted down here for me. So we're saying when I pretend to call this URL, or if I call some code that hits this URL, I want you to go slurp this file and like give that back to me as my response. Max, you got a question? What's up?
Yeah. At what point does like reading a massive file and storing it in a variable, at what point does that, do you get the trade-off for your tests are starting to run too slow? Or is like 5,000 lines, is that not nearly enough to even affect that?
I would say if you can reuse this file over and over again, then the operating system will cache that. So the first time you open it, the operating system may not cache it. But the second time you open it, the operating system may sort of say like, hey, Ruby's asking me for this file a lot. I'm just going to like hang on to it in memory for a little while. And so the operating system will start to cache it. And so it won't take as long to read off of the disk. But there is a minor hit there where it's got to like go out to the operating, well, the Ruby interpreter has to say like, hey, operating system, go get me this file. And the operating system says, okay, here's a handle to the file. And then the interpreter says, okay, now inside that file, I want you to go read all the data out of it. So there's like a little bit of overhead in there. It's not much, but the size of the file matters. You know, if you've got lots and lots of these files, now your GitHub repo is going to be much bigger. Like if I go take a look at the actual size of that file, ls spec fixtures, that file is, you know, almost 1/4 of a megabyte in size. It's 228,000 bytes. You know, now my repo is going to grow by that much. And then any changes I make to that, it's going to start tracking deltas on that file over time too. So yeah, those are all considerations to kind of balance out over time.
So sorry, on that, then how would you get around that? Is that something, the time that you would say, yes, I actually do want to put this in the test, as opposed to reading?
That's a good question. I would say typically what I would do is I would come in here and just like, I would trim out the data a little bit and say, you know, do we really need like all 400 whatever members of Congress? If I'm just trying to like, you know, expect this, you know, expect that I find Bernie Sanders out of all this, I could just trim out everybody but Bernie Sanders. And now Bernie Sanders is like still in the array of members, but I'm only getting back one member in that array because that's all I'm expecting to find. But in this particular case, it could also be like, go get all of the members and show all of them on the page and then let the user pick one. You know, in that case, then we do need to pull in all of that data. So there's give and take on all that. And those are considerations you have to make as a developer.
Thank you.
Cool. So for anybody doing that live note taking, so some helpful things here about Webmock is we can change the status and we can change the body to be whatever we want it to be. So this makes it really helpful for mocking out error conditions for SAD path testing, which will be really, really helpful in later projects, especially for your consultancy project, as well as the sweater weather project at the end. Doing some SAD path testing with Webmock will actually be really beneficial to make sure that you're going to have a good user experience. All right, moving on from here. So the question was raised, well, we're not actually hitting the API. So, you know, is there a trade-off? When could we actually hit the real API? And this is where our next tool is going to come into play. And we're going to spend the next half hour just looking at this tool called VCR. Now, I will ask this question and it will sound silly. Bear with me for asking what may be a silly question. Does anybody here not know what a VCR is? As far as like a piece of electronic equipment. Sometimes it happens. So I just want to double check. I don't want to make assumptions that everybody knows what this is. Yeah, the videotape player. That's exactly right, Catherine. So back in the old days, back in like the 80s, they came up with this idea of like, what if we could record TV shows on magnetic tape? And so they come up with this little machine and you pop in a little cassette with magnetic tape in it, very much like a cassette tape, but it was actually recording the actual video and audio at the same time. And so the idea with a tool called VCR is we're actually hitting record while we make a real API call. We get a real response back, and we're going to store that as fixture data. And so now VCR is basically going to mimic what we just did here in Webmock. But Webmock will still be a useful tool for those SAD path setups that I just talked about, where you want to mimic your own error code or your error status code in your own body of things, where VCR is actually going to be a real recording of actually hitting the API one time, storing that as a response. And then the next time you run your test, it's going to use that cassette and say, I really want to watch that episode of Full House again. It's like popping in that cassette and you're just going to watch it off of that. You're not actually going to like go out to your cable provider and actually watch that show again. And so the idea here is we're going to record it once. And now we have that cassette to reuse. And so the next time we run our test suite, it'll be a little faster because we don't need internet anymore. And we're just going to use these cassettes. Now, these cassettes are also going to be really big because they're storing a lot of data, and we're going to go take a look at some of that. All right, so we're going to start back again with our gem file. In our test section here, where we had Webmock, we're going to add another gem called VCR. And then we need to go bundle on that. So we're only adding it in our test block here, and it's just gem VCR. So we're going to go back out to our console and we're going to run bundle, make sure that we install that gem. And then there's a little bit of setup that we're also going to add to our Rails helper as well. So we're going to open our Rails helper, and down at the very bottom, we've got our shoulda matchers, and then we're going to add a block down here. Now I'm going to type this out instead of just pasting it in from the lesson so I can kind of describe what's going on. So we have a configure block similar to what we have up above with our spec, and we can see here with shoulda matchers. We're going to have a do config. And then inside of here, we're going to set up some configuration parameters. The first one that we need is our cassette library directory. And this is basically where do we want to store these cassettes. We're also going to store these inside our spec fixtures folder that we made, but we're going to make a subfolder off of here, and we're just going to call it VCR cassettes. And then we're going to add one more config flag that says we want to hook into Webmock. Because remember, Webmock is going to stop us from making real internet calls. So what this hook does is VCR and Webmock actually have a good partnership where our code is going to try to make an API call. Webmock's like, thou shalt not pass. And VCR is like, please, could you let that happen so that I can record it? And Webmock's like, all right, VCR, you and I are buddies. I'll allow it. And so that's what that hook into Webmock is going to do here. And Webmock will need to be a symbol, not a variable name. So those are the first configuration options we're going to start with. We're going to add more throughout the next half hour or so. But this is how we're going to configure VCR. All right, so from here now, we're going to go change our test. So we don't need that gem anymore. And we don't need our JSON file to be open. We don't need our controller to be open. But I'm going to have my test. So I'm just going to close out my file panel here for a sec. So inside of here now, what I want to do is I'm actually going to comment out my Webmock setup. And I'm doing this because I want to actually make a real API call and show you how VCR is going to record this and build our response. So I'm just going to comment that out for now. If I try and run that test right now, I'm just going to go find that isolated test again and run that. And what we'll see here is we get a very different error now. And it's also a pretty big error. Now it's an error from VCR saying you're trying to hit an HTTP request that I have not handled. And so this is saying an HTTP request has been made, and VCR doesn't know how you want to handle this. So if this is something intentional, then here's some notes about things that we can do. So this means it's working so far. So now we need to tell our test that we want to use VCR, because VCR and Webmock are saying like, hey, Webmock is saying, you're not allowed. VCR is like, pretty please let it be allowed. And Webmock says, I'll allow it. But now VCR is like, well, wait, the test hasn't actually told me that I'm supposed to get used. So now how do we tell our test to use VCR? And there are a couple of different ways that we can do it. The first way we're going to do this is we're actually going to wrap all of this code in another block of code. So we're going to indent all of this. And we're going to start here by saying VCR, use cassette. And now we need to give it a file name of some kind. Now we don't have to give it spec fixtures VCR cassettes. We just give it just the file name. Because our configuration option, we told it where to put the cassettes. This is just the file name for the cassette, but it's just part of the file name. And I'll get into and explain some of that. So we're just going to call this like all Senate members for now. And then we have a do block. And now all of this stuff is going to live inside that do block, which means we need an end statement for it. So all I did was I indented all of this stuff and I put it inside this block where we say, I want to use this VCR cassette. Now we haven't made a cassette yet, but the cool thing about VCR is when you say, hey, VCR, I want you to use this cassette. For anyone that actually remembers the VCR cassette, it had a little label on there and you could write something on it. What we're saying is, hey, VCR, go use this cassette by name. If it's not there, if that file doesn't exist, VCR is like, well, you want me to use a cassette. I haven't got that cassette. So I'm actually going to go do that API call and I'm going to save it as that cassette. This makes it really handy later if we wanted to, say, make another call. Let's say we had another test down here. We could say, I also want to use that cassette, but do something slightly different. The first one of these that runs, VCR is going to say, I don't have that cassette. So I'm going to go create the cassette. And then the second test that uses that cassette, VCR is like, cool, I got you. I already got a cassette with that name. And so it's only going to go make one API call, record the cassette, and now we can reuse that cassette over and over again. Someone mentioned in chat taping over the Lion King. Yeah, that would be bad. VCR goes to Blockbuster for us, exactly. Yeah, for those that understand Blockbuster and that reference and so on. So by having these cassette names, we can actually reuse these cassettes. This is also really helpful across like different test files. They can all access those same cassettes. So we're making real API calls. We're storing the request and the response. And now we can reuse those over and over again. So super handy for that. So let's go see what happens when I actually go run this test. I'm actually going to comment or actually just remove this other test because we don't actually need it. I just wanted to show you that you can reutilize that VCR use cassette over and over again, and it'll actually reuse that VCR cassette. So let's go run that test, not Postman. Let's go actually run that test again. Now that we've told our test to use VCR, now our test passes. So let's go see what happened in our code and in our file system. If we go look at our fixture subfolder, now it made our VCR cassette folder for us. And inside of that, we've got this cool YAML file of our whole request and the whole response. So we've got the whole response coming back here. If we look at the body, this is the actual JSON response that we got back. We can actually see here, for example, that ProPublica is sending us back all this white space. What a waste of internet bandwidth. They should like trim out white space. But we can see that whole response coming back over here. Whole response is coming back. So that's pretty cool. It recorded that request, recorded the response. If I go run that test again, it's going to pass. It's going to run slightly faster because now it doesn't actually have to go make a real internet connection. It's just going to reuse that cassette. So pretty handy. There's one problem in here though. Anybody guess what problem we might face that have not yet read ahead on the lesson plan? Anybody know what problem we might run into with this? Aiden, what do you think?
If the API structure changes for that response.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the same kind of problem that we would have also faced with Webmock. Where, yeah, so if the structure changes, if the data changes, if we're expecting Bernie Sanders to always be in here, and let's say Bernie retires next year or something, or a couple of years down the road, now this data's stale, we're not going to be able to find Bernie Sanders in here anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be a problem anytime we use these kinds of tools for API testing. Gus, any thoughts?
Is your API key in there somewhere?
It
There
is,
it is.
yeah, because it's storing the full request and the response. So the neat thing about VS Code and Atom, if you move over into your margin over here, you can actually collapse these things. But we can see in the request, we see our method, we see our URI, we see the body that we sent over. Our body was empty. We see the headers that we sent over, and then we see the response of everything that came back. But yeah, here's our API key. If we were to push this cassette up to GitHub, now we've exposed our API key, which we want to keep secret. And so there's going to be a little cool little workaround for that. V, did you have any other thoughts to add on that?
No, I have a question. Just want to make sure that I understand what's happening. Because okay, so if I understand correctly, that you run the test, it's going to create the VCR, it's going to make a real request, create the VCR, save the body. After that, all the requests will not make up all tests that you run after that for that specific VCR will not make a real call. We just access that file that's you save the information, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so any other test I write where I say I want to go use this cassette file name, VCR is going to say, cool, I've already got that cassette, so I'm just going to reuse that. Now, if you tell it to use a cassette name that's no longer there, because maybe we want to go in and we want to like delete those cassettes from time to time so that we actually go make real API calls and make sure that we've got fresh data, then VCR is like, I haven't got that cassette. I'm actually going to go make an API call and then save that as a request, or save that as a cassette. Yeah, go ahead.
Then I'm confused about this idea of like the structures will change and then you can't find Bernie, because our data, like locally, the body still has it, even if the API was updated and it doesn't have it anymore.
Right. Which is true. So for the sake of this test, we're going to assume that Bernie Sanders is always going to exist in this data. But if our user on our website is actually searching for Bernie Sanders later and Bernie retires, now that's not actually going to be there. But our test says that Bernie is going to show up if they try to search for Bernie. And so that's where we're going to end up with a disconnect, because in production, it's not behaving the same way as our test is. Our test is saying, go pretend to go hit that API key, pretend to actually find Bernie Sanders, and then happy path, Bernie Sanders is on the page. Where in production, that's not going to work anymore because Bernie Sanders retires at some point. And now Bernie Sanders is not going to show up in a real call, but meanwhile, we have a test that says it will work.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. And then let's go to Ryan and then Sandra.
Hey, and I was just wondering, could you ignore the VCR cassettes to that because they have the API key, or is that? I'm sure you have a better way of doing it, but that's my guess, like off the top of my head.
We could ignore it, yeah. The downside, though, then is when we push all this stuff up to Travis, Travis is going to go run all those tests. And then Travis is also going to be storing VCR cassettes because we told our test to actually go use a cassette. So now Travis is going to go build cassettes, which could be helpful. It'll only build one set of cassettes. And if you're reusing that cassette, now Travis only has to make one real API call, and then everything else can use the cassette after that. But there is a configuration flag that we're going to see where we can actually hide that.
All right.
Yep, good question though. Let's go to Sandra and then back to Aiden.
And this might be something you're going to cover, so feel free to skip this. But like because of that risk, and like I read, like some companies like will, if they use VCR or something similar, like have it periodically, like every night they delete the cassettes, or every week or something for that reason.
This is
like how do you
this is something that we did at SendGrid. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, how would you write a test that is going to be sustainable, like long term? That's like dynamic enough to handle.
That's a good question. That's a good question. Because yeah, if we're searching by name and that person's going to retire at some point, like unless we find a really young member of Congress that's going to be there, as a lifer and be there for 40 years or 50 years, whatever, some of them have stuck around, then yeah, I mean, that data is going to change over time unless we start looking for really generic names like Smith. I'm sure there's a Congress person with a last name of Smith in there somewhere. But even that could break. What if there is no Smith as a member of Congress at some point? So there's no good way to make that durable. You're right. At SendGrid, we had kind of an unspoken rule on the team that whoever the first person is in the office on Monday deleted all the cassettes, ran the full test suite, and pushed all that back up to GitHub so that by the time everybody else got to the office, we all had a set of fresh cassettes to use for the week. And that generally worked okay, but our test suite also took 45 minutes to run. That's how many tests that we had for this platform that we were building. It took a really, really long time to run. And that's not really sustainable either. Just having to like go do things for real and like store all these things. But the nice thing is there's also a configuration flag that we're also going to look at that says like go refresh the cassettes after a known period of time. We can also do that as a flag with use cassette. There's a flag that you can put in here that says like go refresh this after a day or 7 days or something like that. But that'll only work with a VCR use cassette. But let's go take a look at these other configuration options first, and then I'll get to Max's question and James' question. So hang on to those questions. We'll be back after these messages. All right, so let's go figure out how to suppress that stuff out of our file here, because we don't want that to be in there. So in our Rails helper, what we're going to do in here is we're going to add a configuration flag called config.filter sensitive data. And what we have to do here is we have to give it two things. One is the string that we want to filter, and the other one is what we want to filter it with. But those are actually coming in the opposite order that I just mentioned them. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say this is what we're looking for, and this is what we're replacing it with. So this is the order that we actually build these in that configuration flag. So filter sensitive data, what we're searching for is going to be inside a set of curly braces, and what we're replacing it with is going to be inside a set of quotes here. So what we're going to do here is I'm just going to grab this env thing that we had in our Webmock before. What we're going to search for is our env key. Just that way we don't have to actually put our real API key in here, because this file also gets pushed up to GitHub. So we're saying, I want to, like anywhere that I use this env ProPublica API key within the scope of using VCR, I want to replace it with, don't expose my data. You can call this whatever you want. You can call it like super secret is literally just going to do a search and replace on these things. So let's go run that test again. And then we're going to go back and take a look at that cassette. All right, so let's go back to our code and let's go back and look at that cassette, and that didn't work. And it didn't work because the file's already there. VCR said, you told me to use the cassette. I've already got a cassette, so I'm not going to go like do all this stuff. I've already got that cassette. So we actually have to go delete the cassette first. So if we go delete that file and then go run that test again, and then go look at that file in our editor, now we see that it replaced it with don't expose my data. So you're going to do that for every API key. So with your movie tracker project, you'll only have one API key. In other projects, you can have multiple API keys, and you're going to have to add that as a configuration option for every API that you're doing. One sec. My son apparently won second place at our county level spelling bee. Good job, dude. Everybody, this is William. What? All right. That's going on YouTube later, by the way, that you won the county level thing, because this video is going up on YouTube later.
Okay, nice. You'll be on YouTube. Yay.
Yeah, YouTube famous. All right, good job, buddy. Cool. All right, it's in the history books. That's right. I don't know what the winning word was. I'll find out from him afterward. Cool. So we see that that's done. I've got one more configuration option that we're going to take a look at. And this is actually two things that we're going to look at. So the next one that we want to look at is, this is all fine and good in our test if we want to say use cassette, but do we really have to do that every test? Is there something simpler that we can do where we don't have to indent all this stuff? And the answer is yes. In our Rails helper, we're going to add another configuration flag in here that says configure RSpec metadata with a bang on the end. And this is in the lesson plan. I'm just going to kind of go through this real quick just for the sake of time. What this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to use a little flag on the end of our test it block, where we don't have to say VCR use cassette anymore. So I'm just going to comment that out. I'm going to comment out our end. And what that flag is going to allow us to do is now we can just do a VCR symbol. So we need to put comma VCR right here. And this is saying go use VCR for this test. What that metadata thing is going to do is it's actually going to use all of these strings. So government search, happy path allows users to search for government members. And it's actually going to build a folder for every describe string. And then the it block is going to be the file name. And so if we go run that test again, VCR is going to say, okay, you want me to use VCR? Based on this metadata, I don't have that file name. And so you can see it actually popped up over here. So now we have a folder called government search, because that was our describe block. Inside of that is another folder, which VS Code is kind of hiding, but called happy path, which was our next describe. And then inside of that, it made a file called allows user to search for government members. And there's our VCR cassette. And there's our hidden API key that we had before. Now, if we want to reuse this cassette, we need that whole file name path for VCR. And so if you really want to use that as a file name in another test, let me show you how we would do that. So after that it block, let's go pretend that we want to go use that. So instead of using the VCR flag, you can't use both. You can't have the VCR and a use cassette. You got to be one or the other. What we can do in here now is we can actually just give it that whole path in here. So what we do here instead is we'd actually say government search / happy path / allows users blah 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 allows user. You got to make sure the spelling is right, because if the spelling is wrong, it's going to go make a new cassette, because those labels on the VCR cassette's not going to match. So it actually has to be an exact file name match. So what I'm going to do over here in VS Code, I'm going to hit enter, which goes into file modification mode. I'm just going to hit copy on that and then go back over here and just paste. So we don't need the .yaml on the end. It's not the actual file name, but we have to give it the path and the reference to that file name. And now we can reuse like a metadata cassette where we used VCR. Now we can go use that cassette over and over again. But we have to kind of understand that whole path of where to go find that file. So that's the only caveat there, is that, you know, the deeper these folders go and the bigger the file names get, it gets a little harder to figure out where those cassettes are. And again, if you misspell something, or even like if I put in a lowercase s here, it's actually going to go build a new cassette with a lowercase s, because Unix-based operating systems are case sensitive for file names. So you got to be really careful about the spelling, otherwise you're going to end up with duplicate cassettes. I got one more flag to look through, and then I'll get to questions. I just want to make sure that we get through this for the lesson. So manually deleting these is kind of a pain in the butt. So there's one more thing that we can do, and we can set kind of a default configuration flag in our RSpec helper and our Rails helper, that where we say, like, just on the regular, every 7 days or every 1 hour or whatever, I want to rebuild these cassettes. And you can use Ruby to set this to whatever you want. You can say every 5 minutes, every 1 hour, every 31 days, every 1 year, just go rebuild new cassettes. For something like members of Congress, we really only need this to happen like every, 2 years? Between Senate and Congress, like they're either there for 2 years or 6 years, right? And so if we set this to like a 2-year expiration, we're always going to get fresh data. So even if we said like 1 year, that would probably be enough. But maybe some of our tests we want to do differently. And that's where on an individual cassette basis, if you're using vcr.useCassette, you can also add a flag here that says, for this cassette, I want it to be like, 7 days or 1 day or 1 hour or something. But you can only do that with the VCR use cassette flag. All right, let's get to some questions. We got James and then Max.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going back to what Sandra was asking.
Okay.
When you're like building your Webmock testing, your VCR testing, would it be a good case if you're like constantly refreshing your cassettes to test the like structure of the JSON file that you're getting back versus the actual like name of the senator?
So like, yeah, you totally could. Yeah, you totally could. So yeah, and we'll see a little bit of this as we get into the refactoring classes. This test isn't really testing, that the structure of the data came back fine. But when we get into the refactoring class next week, I'll show you like how and at what level we want to make sure that we test these things. Yeah. Cool. Let's go to Max and then Sam.
So let's say at some point you did push up your API key in a cassette to GitHub. How would you then like remove that and remove all of the like Git saves for it? And is that something to worry about? Or and same with any of this like mocking out.
Yeah, that's a fair question, because it will happen. I mean, just count on it happening at some point. As an aside, if you ever use like GitHub's API keys for anything, and you accidentally push that up to GitHub, GitHub will actually scan your repo. And if it sees one of its own API keys anywhere in your code, it'll immediately deactivate that API key so that nobody can abuse it. We actually had some abuse reports at SendGrid of people using accounts for spam, for sending actual spam emails. And so one of our support reps actually wrote a script that went and looked for anybody that was using SendGrid's like Ruby gem or Python module and like all these like libraries that we publish for different languages, and then looked for credentials in those repos. And we actually found where customers were pushing their actual credentials up to public GitHub repos. And so our support rep just went in and like started deactivating all the customers. And then the customers would call saying, why can't I send email? And we're like, hey, dummy, you pushed your credentials up to GitHub. So we shut off those credentials. You need to go make new credentials and maybe don't push them up to GitHub next time. You can go back and like scrub some of that stuff out of the history, but it's a pretty involved process. So I would say if you do happen to do that, the easiest thing, honestly, is just go back to the MovieDB or whatever and just get a fresh API key. You can usually go into a lot of these systems where you're registering for API keys and say, can you like deregister that as an API key, like issue me a new one. And most of them will do that for you. And then you can just start using that, but then make sure that your code isn't also pushing up that API key in some way. Yep.
Gotcha.
Good question. Let's go to Sam for questions.
Could you just hover back really quick to the Rails helper? Because I wanted to check out that flag
Yeah.
for that thing running in the background to check the time. So this runs every time VCR runs, and it checks for a starting point and if it hit 1 year, as opposed to it's not running in the background, right? It's only running whenever VCR runs. Okay.
So yeah, so it's going to run for any test that uses VCR. So you can write a test that doesn't use VCR, in which case Webmock will trip and say, hey, you're trying to make an API call. You haven't set up Webmock or VCR. Like you got to use one. So what'll happen, let me go back and show you the VCR cassette. Just pop this one open. Inside here, we have our request, we have our response, and we actually have these dates in here of when these things actually happened. And that's the, it's either that or there's, I think it's that field. There might be a slightly different field where it's actually building out, there it is, recorded at. So it's using this recorded at field in the YAML file, and it's actually comparing that against the date today, and then say, is the difference between today and this date greater than what you've set here as a global configuration flag? If it's greater, I'm just going to ignore this cassette. So even though you've got a cassette with this name, the time has expired. Therefore, I'm going to go record a new cassette for you, and it'll just delete that file and re-record that cassette. So there's nothing else that you need to do at that point. This flag, incidentally, didn't exist when I worked at SendGrid. I really wish it did, because it was a real nuisance. Like everybody, like everybody's start time got later and later and later on Mondays because nobody wanted the task of actually showing up and like deleting all the cassettes. And yeah, anyway, cool. Let's go to Sandra for questions.
Maybe I just completely spaced out. So, but like, okay, so we're not wanting to push our API key up. But like even on line 78 there, where we're doing like environment, the ProPublica API to the right there a little bit.
Yep.
Where we're calling that, where is it calling it from? Like, where is it originating from?
This part here. So this is from our Figaro setup. So in Figaro, we've set up this environment key in our application.yaml file. For some reason it can't find that. So config application.yaml, there it is. So inside of here, this is where we're setting up environment keys. So this is the key and this is the value. And so Figaro is using this application.yaml file in our config folder to say, go like as you run Rails or as you run your tests, go build an environment key with this name and set it to this value. And so now, sorry, go ahead.
I just
No,
like,
you go ahead.
Isn't that file also getting pushed up? Like, I guess, how is that different than?
No, the application YAML file is in our git ignore file. And so that actually, so when you run Figaro install, it'll complain because I've already done all of this, but it's saying, do you want to overwrite this file? I'll say no. And it says, cool, well, I already found a git ignore, so I'm not going to alter that. So the very first time you run this, it'll actually alter your git ignore file to include that file. So if we cat our git ignore, we actually see that we've ignored that application config. So anything you put in that file is not going to get pushed up to GitHub.
Okay, so like it's built in, it like knows it should go there, live there. Like we didn't have to explicitly put it in that file.
We didn't have to put it in here because as long as you run Figaro install, it'll take care of those steps for you. Yep.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. These are great questions. We got a couple of minutes left. I'm happy to take any other questions, go back over like the stuff that we covered. So again, Webmock would be really handy for mocking out error conditions and sad path stuff about our APIs, and VCR will be helpful for the happy path stuff. And then with those different settings and so on that we covered out of the lesson plan for like hooking into Webmock, not exposing our API keys, allowing us to use the : VCR on our tests, so we don't have to do a VCR use cassette. But what I'll do is I'm actually going to push up this as an example. I'll leave this empty test in here of like how to actually go reuse a cassette that you otherwise did like a VCR flag. Just that way you'll have a reference back for that. And then just the re-record interval. Now, typically it wouldn't be a year. This would be more like a week or a month or something like that. So I'll just set it to 1 week for now. Cool. We got Aiden and then Max.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand. So we're going to be using VCR for happy path testing with Webmock, and then we'll be using Webmock and then the slurping method you showed earlier for sad path testing.
Yep, generally, yep. In the consultancy project, you'll also use Webmock for, hey, I don't even know what the API is going to look like yet, because you can have a Rails front end and a Rails back end as two different repos. And you're not going to know yet, like when the front end has to hit an API endpoint on the back end, you're not going to know what that response is going to look like. And so you're going to use Webmock to say, well, until that actually gets built, and then I can actually use VCR, I'm going to mock that the response is going to look like this. And then you can actually use that to TDD your code. And then once the back end does get built, then you'll switch to VCR instead. But Webmock will still be helpful for SADPath stuff. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I had one more quick question. Would front end and back end Rails, will they each have a like different API key for their repo? And then will they also have a different API key for like testing versus development?
We'll talk about that once we get into the consultancy thing. That won't really be relevant for what we're doing right now. You won't be authenticating to your own APIs in that consultancy project unless you want to, but it won't be a requirement for that project. Cool. Let's see, Max, I think you're up next.
Yeah, if you would go back to the government search spec for 1 second, I just wanted to check that the lower test doesn't also need to be named allows user to search for government members. That could be named anything.
Oh,
is that right? Because it happens in the use cassette?
Right. Yep.
Okay.
So some other, well, in this case though, we aren't using the VCR flag. But yeah, generally you want all these things to be uniquely named.
Gotcha.
Yep. Yeah, good catch there, Max. Thanks. V asked in chat with so with VCR, you won't use the stub at all, or you will, but for SADPath. So I would say we're only going to do the stub, the Webmock stub, if you want to do SADPath, and you're going to use VCR if it's going to be happy path. That'll be kind of the easiest path forward for right now.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem, V. Cool. Great questions. Let's wrap up there. If you do have other questions, please drop them in the Code Help channel. Thanks for those that were taking care of the live note taking in that Google Doc. You can share that that Google file out. We'll get this up on YouTube, later in the day, probably this evening. And then I'm going to get that video archive thing all up to date with all the YouTube video links and so on. We still have a bunch of videos on Vimeo if you want to go back and reference any of those as well. Cool. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. And let's see, as far as schedule goes for the rest of the day, you got accountability buddies now, and then you get a little bit of project work time. If you want to hang out for the community lunch, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll see you for Gear Up at 1:30. I will drop a link at 1 for like a little bit of pre-reading. If you want to do that ahead of the Gear Up, you can. You won't have to. But if you got a little bit of time between the community lunch and the Gear Up starting at 1:30, then you can jump in and pre-read some of that if you want. Otherwise, we'll see you at 1:30 for Gear Up. Thanks, everyone. You will not have an attendance thread at 1. I'll be taking attendance at Gear Up.
Thanks, Ian.
Cool. See you, everybody.